Joan of Arc was a peasant of extremely humble origins who became one of the most well-known heroines in human history. To think that her whole story unfolded here in this region of France. I'm about 2 hours from Paris. We're arriving in Orleans. A woman leading the French army to win a war against England that had already gone on for a very long time. It's hard to even imagine a woman 600 years ago leading the French army in a much more sexist time than ours. All of this happened here. When they asked why Joan of Arc was fighting that war, a woman stepping into a world of men on the battlefield, you have to remember that we're here on a French road today, but all of this used to be a battlefield. And she came here saying she was inspired by voices. She heard voices, had a divine inspiration, and also had visions. And that inspired a lot of people. It was extremely important for France's victory. But later, Joan ended up paying a high price because of her inspirations, precisely because of what she said, what she was hearing and seeing. And then the worst happened. One day, Joan of Arc was captured by the enemies, convicted of several crimes she hadn't committed, and was condemned for heresy. She was sexually abused. She was also condemned for witchcraft, and well, what did they do to witches back then? Joan of Arc was burned at the stake at the age of 19. And that's how things are, right? It took a long time. Only in the 20th century did the Catholic Church decide to canonize Joan of Arc, making her Saint Joan of Arc, now even one of the patron saints of France. Well, more than deserved. A statue of a victorious woman with her sword in hand, mounted on a horse in the center of a square in the middle of the city, the most important place. Where else in the world do you find that? I keep trying to remember here. Maybe I don't know, maybe it doesn't exist. Or if they do exist, there are very few statues of women heroines. Even more so when you think that this was in the Middle Ages, almost 600 years ago. Well, you already know, right? This one behind me is Joan of Arc, whom the French call Jeanne d'Arc, the greatest heroine in the history of Europe. The woman who changed the history of France and started right here in this city. Our special today is about her. A young woman who lived only a few years, but in those few years changed history. France and England are practically neighbors, separated by the English Channel, where today a bullet train connects the two countries at an impressively fast speed. But in the past, this distance was immense, and they were anything but friendly neighbors. For more than 500 years, England claimed the throne of France. More than that, starting from the year 1340, with two brief exceptions. All the kings and queens of what would later become the United Kingdom declared themselves and held the titles of monarchs of France. Even the coats of arms of the English kings had direct references to France, as if one kingdom belonged to the other. Both in this one of Edward III in the 14th century and in that of George III, which lasted until the beginning of the 19th century, we see the fleur-de-lis, which is the French symbol. Only in the new coat of arms, which came into effect in 1801, was the fleur-de-lis replaced by the Scottish lion, even though the motto meaning God and my right continued to be written in French. And there was a very critical period precisely during the short life of Joan of Arc, when the English occupied about 2/3 of French territory. But the French on this side of the English Channel did not recognize this English control. They did not accept the orders of the King of England, and because of that they went to war, a war so intense that it became known as the 100 Years' War, although it lasted longer than that. And a decisive figure for the outcome of this war would be the young Joan, a teenager who would only much later be called Saint Joan of Arc. Everywhere you go here in Orléans, there are references to Joan of Arc. Well, first, the main street is called Joan of Arc. And all over the city, there are these marks on the ground, which are bronze pieces with the inscription Orléans. And Joan of Arc's horse, with her riding it and carrying a banner pointing tourists and visitors to the places connected to the saint's history. But what happens? There are marks like this everywhere here in Orléans because Joan of Arc is really everywhere in this city. I was walking here, but I decided to stop because I remembered that I've been saying Joan of Arc all the time. That's right. In Portuguese, it's Joanna d'Arc, but the French say Jeanne d'Arc. And most likely, she was never called by any of those names. The old name in archaic French was Jeanne. A little different, right? And the last name, was it really Dark? There are some theories. One is that it was Joan d'Arc, another that it was Joan d'Ale, maybe Joan d'Arc the Dark. Who knows? But the truth is that the name she knew, what she was called, was Jeanne. But we'll keep calling her Joan of Arc. Whatever the correct way to say her name is, if it weren't for that young French woman, the flag that flies over these lands might be this other one. Jeanne was the daughter of a very poor peasant who rented the land he farmed to provide for his family. She was the youngest of 5 siblings, extremely religious according to what they say, and since she was 13 years old, she claimed to have visions and hear voices. When she was born in that little house in 1412, the village of Domremy-la-Pucelle had been occupied by the English and was one of the settings of the 100 Years' War. It was during this time that 2/3 of the territory that now makes up France came under the effective control of the English and their allies from the Kingdom of Burgundy. The war had started many decades earlier, in 1337, by order of the English King Edward III, who was the son of a Frenchwoman. Queen Isabella, Edward III was from the House of Windsor, which still occupies the British throne today. You might also wonder, as I did, how did the English believe they had a right to the Kingdom of France? Especially living so far away, separated by the sea. What sense did that make, right? A lot. France speaks a completely different language from English. They have nothing to do with each other. Merci, which I just said to him here, for example, the English say thank you. In other words, there's no relation. The roots are completely different. The cultures are different, the foods are different. I'm here now with creme brulee, which is a kind of, let's say, French pudding with sugar cream, right? Caramel on top, cream underneath, which isn't typical of England either. So the cultures are very different, the countries are far apart, but even so, the English felt like they owned all of this here. The sense of humor is completely different. Actually, I prefer the English sense of humor, the culture, the values. There are a lot of differences, right? The French drink coffee like we do, and the English prefer tea. Actually, the English only drink tea all the time. There's afternoon tea, right? Famous. I was gonna say that the French drink wine, but the English also drink a lot of wine. The French just produce more wine. The English, they're great at analyzing the wine that the French produce. By the way, for a long time, French wine was a treasure in England. And even today, the English are the best analysts. They're among the best wine analysts in the world. The food here is very delicate, very elaborate, much more so than in England. In fact, in England's colonies, former colonies, like in the United States, the food also became healthy, simple over there. Not here, it's much more elaborate. Now there's something that both countries have in common, and not many people know about it. The British royal family has its roots in a region that today belongs to France. In the 11th century, William the Conqueror conquered England. He was from Normandy in the north of France. And so, if a conqueror from this side could take over the other side, that's what the English thought. Why not do the opposite? And it's interesting to see how royal marriages made that so-called European blue blood become more mixed as well. For example, the British royal family, headed by King Charles III, has strong German ancestry. His father, Prince Philip, was from the Battenberg family, but shortly before marrying Queen Elizabeth, he adopted the English translation of the name and became Mountbatten. And do you remember William the Conqueror, the King of England, who was born in Normandy? Well, he was a Viking. It's no wonder that in the 19th century, Queen Victoria of England started being called the grandmother of Europe. Well, first she married the Prince of Prussia. Her children married princesses and princes from 8 different countries. Europe is really a mess here. Do you think blue blood doesn't mix? They do mix. You also considered marriages of convenience, right? Of course, they've always had marriages of convenience. Everything was very well arranged so that the powerful could gain more power or sometimes lose power, and it even reached Brazil. Shall we call Sergio Patrick, our host, to join this conversation? Patrick? Welcome to this episode.
I brought my coffee. How's everyone?
Patrick, are there marriages of convenience in Brazil? How did the name Orleans from this city here end up in the Brazilian royal family?
If it was a marriage of convenience, I don't know, but it was definitely between royal families. In fact, the descendants of the Brazilian royal family today are Orleans and Bragança. But the Orleans family never ruled in Brazil. The member of the Orleans family who went to Brazil was the Count d'Eu, who was married to Princess Isabel. He was Princess Isabel's husband. If Princess Isabel had inherited the throne from Dom Pedro II, then we would have had a Brazilian, we would have had an Orleans on the Brazilian throne. Yes, sir?
Lucky prince.
Lucky Prince Gaston d'Orléans, which was the name of Count d'Eu.
You know that Princess Isabel was not a queen, but she gave the crown, a crown, to Our Lady of Aparecida, who was crowned in 1904 Patroness of Brazil.
So at least she made a queen. She wasn't a queen, but she made a queen, right?
Patrick, you who live in the United States, is there also a connection between the city of Orleans, which was liberated by Joan of Arc, and the city of New Orleans in the United States, which was a French colony, right?
Yes, it was a French colony since the 17th century, and because it started at that time, the region was called Louisiana. Louisiana, yes, exactly. It's a reference to Louis XIII, the Sun King, who was then the King of France. Today, we know it as Louisiana. It was sold to the United States at the beginning of the 19th century, 1800, in 1803. And then the city that was founded there? New Orleans was a reference to Prince Philippe II, who was the Duke of Orleans at the time. And the city of New Orleans to this day celebrates this connection with Orleans in France, including...
They are sister cities.
They are sister cities. And New Orleans in the United States holds celebrations for Joan of Arc every year.
There's strong devotion to Joan of Arc.
There is devotion over there as well.
Shall we go back to the story of Joan of Arc? For all that we've seen, since the Middle Ages, there have been many historical and political reasons for a terrible rivalry between the peoples we now call the English and the French. Joan of Arc was born exactly during a critical period of this conflict and grew up with deeply nationalistic ideals. To make things even more tense, in 1420, when Joan was 8 years old, the English and the French signed the Treaty of Troyes, which arranged the marriage between Princess Catherine of Valois of France and King Henry V of England. And in addition, it ceded the Kingdom of France to England as soon as the French King Charles VI died. But why, after all, did the French agree to hand over their kingdom to the English just like that, without a fight, without anything, and even with a signed document? At that time, France was greatly weakened by the long war against England and had already lost a large part of its territory. And the French king, Charles VI, was considered mentally unstable, so much so that he was known as Charles the Mad. And between continuing with a war that already seemed lost with this unstable king, and being ruled by King Henry V, healthy, powerful King of England. The French ended up preferring English control. Even the wife of the king, called the Mad Isabeau of Bavaria, decided to support the treaty. "If my husband is unstable, let the English come." I can imagine her saying, thinking the problem is that with this, Isabeau's son, the heir Charles VII, lost the right to be king. What no one expected was that the kings would die practically at the same time. Between August and October of 1422, Charles and Henry said goodbye to this world. But since Henry V of England died first, the situation, which was already politically very unstable, descended into chaos. And suddenly Charles VII, the son of the dead king, decided to claim his right to the throne. The French decided to keep fighting to preserve the kingdom. And in the next 6 years, there was more war, more uncertainty, and a lot of bloodshed. At that time, Joan of Arc was no longer a girl, she was a teenager. We imagine she looked something like this statue, which still stands today in an old hotel here in Orleans. And she made a very courageous decision. She would go to the king to tell him that she wanted to fight for France. It is said that Joan cut her hair very short and wore men's clothes so that the journey would be less dangerous. She convinced some soldiers to accompany her and went to the palace of Charles VII in Chinon, in the French region of the Loire Valley. Tradition says that Charles heard Joan was on her way, and it is also said that he heard the prophecies that the young peasant girl would free France from the English. King Charles VII wanted to test Joan of Arc. He took off his royal clothes, dressed as a commoner, and mingled with the staff. They told Joan of Arc that the king was someone else, but she wasn't fooled. She walked out and went straight to the king. And when she came before Charles VII, she knelt down and said something more or less like this: "Most noble lord, she was sent by God to bring help to you and your kingdom." Inspired by the visions of Saint Michael the Archangel, Saint Catherine of Alexandria, and Saint Margaret of Antioch. "I will liberate Orleans and take you, my lord, to Reims, so that you may be crowned King of France." The clergyman who witnessed that scene saw it as a divine sign. In fact, the first of many signs that would later be used in the canonization of St. Joan of Arc. Since his father's death, the heir had been waiting to be crowned, but he was in a legal limbo. According to the traditions of the time, the investiture ceremony had to take place at Reims Cathedral. But the city in the Champagne region was under English control. As long as the succession was not legally completed, the crown was at risk of being permanently taken by the enemy. And then necessity met opportunity. You have to imagine how much Charles VII wanted to be king, and at that point he had no right to the throne. He needed to defeat England. He was enchanted, deeply impacted by everything he saw and heard. The visions of Joan of Arc, her divine inspiration, everything she heard and everything she said to the king, to the future king that day. Charles VII decided to accept Joan's proposal and sent her to the battlefield. But he took a precaution. Joan would leave hidden inside a convoy, supply convoy, so she wouldn't be seen by the enemy. The year we relive here in Orleans is 1429. At that time, the two nations were already in a terrible war. England had conquered Paris and also many parts of northern France, including Normandy and Brittany. And the English troops were already heading south. The English had Burgundy as an ally, which is now part of France, but at that time was an independent kingdom. The French troops were practically surrounded here in Orleans and also in the Loire Valley, in the center of French territory. The image that made it into the history books is very striking. Joan of Arc arriving here in Orleans, wearing her armor, wielding a sword and a banner with the cross of Jesus Christ. Determined to go to war, and this immediately inspired the troops and lifted the morale of the French. Joan couldn't read or write, but she dictated letters that were sent to the English commanders, in which she said, "In the name of God, retreat, or I will make you flee." And she signed the texts under the name The Maid. The commander of the French troops in Orléans couldn't believe what he was seeing, a teenage girl giving orders to his army. Because of that, of course, he refused to follow the strategies she proposed. That's when the unexpected happened. The French soldiers were inspired by the fighting spirit of Joan of Arc, and they also had some crucial help from nature. A natural barrier stood in front of the English, the Loire River, since the territories they occupied were in the north and what was left of France was here on the southern side. In this battle won by the French, there was said to be yet another manifestation of the supernatural that manifested itself through Joan of Arc. Tradition says that at a very critical moment in the war, she stopped a fierce wind. And with that, the French were able to dock their ships to unload weapons and supplies and continue the war. Later, this event would be understood as a sign and was used in the canonization of Saint Joan of Arc. The victory at the Siege of Orléans was the turning point in the 100 Years' War. Little by little, the battle strategies proposed by Joan began to work. One by one, cities in central France were retaken and the English began to flee. During one of these retreats, French troops wanted to attack the wounded English who were still resisting. But Joan would not have allowed it, claiming that it was Sunday, a holy day. Every time I come here, I'm impressed by the Cathedral of the Holy Cross of Orléans. Now that it's May, it's all decorated to celebrate the feast of Joan of Arc. The cathedral was built starting in 1601, which means it was long after the death of Joan of Arc. It was finished more than 200 years later, but to this day it's practically a memorial dedicated to the warrior saint. When the cathedral was built, she wasn't a saint yet, but people in France were already very devoted to her. Joan of Arc met again with the heir to the throne, Charles VII, and begged. She told him to hurry to Reims, that he needed to be crowned soon to put an end to the threat that still hung over the French. Charles VII hesitated, but after new victories in important battles, the way became less dangerous and he was finally able to be crowned at Reims Cathedral on July 17, 1429. Joan of Arc was invited, the guest of honor at the ceremony, always wearing men's clothing, as she had done since the beginning of her military career. After the king's coronation ceremony, Joan of Arc considered that her mission had been accomplished. She was going to stop, but Charles VII asked for one more mission. She needed to help him liberate Paris, which was still under English control. Without retaking the French capital, Charles VII knew that Joan would have total control over the kingdom. Joan of Arc accepted the new mission, and in the first offensive to retake Paris, the English fled, but not their allies, the troops of the Kingdom of Burgundy. Then, in a new battle, Joan of Arc was wounded by an arrow and the French thought it best to retreat. That's when we realize her importance. Because Joan of Arc was wounded, they retreated. Shortly after, in the Battle of Compiègne, Joan of Arc ended up being captured. And that was the beginning of the end of her brief story. Joan was taken prisoner by the Burgundians. She was sold to the English and transferred to Rouen, a famous city in Normandy where she would eventually die. And then they managed to change history, or at least they found crimes that no one had talked about until then. Joan was locked in a dark cell guarded by 5 men day and night. At the beginning of the following year, a trial began in an ecclesiastical court where she was accused of heresy and witchcraft because of the voices she claimed to hear. But wait, weren't the voices the ones that saved France? Joan always said that it was saints who guided her actions, but the inquisitors believed that she was possessed by the devil. She was also accused of blasphemy for wearing men's clothing and for refusing to bow to the clergy judges, saying that she would only be judged by God. Altogether, Joan of Arc was convicted of 70 religious crimes. The records, the documents that attest to what happened in this trial have been kept until today in 3 copies held by the French government. In April of that year, 1431, Joan was found in her cell on the verge of death in a possible suicide attempt to escape execution. And this story has a very sad ending. On May 30th, 1431, Joan of Arc was taken to the central square of the city of Rouen. They say she was dressed in white and was taken by the guards to what would be her final moments, to her execution. Joan of Arc was burned alive. She wasn't even 20 years old at that time. Her ashes were thrown into the Seine River so that the burial place or possible burial place would not become a place of worship. They didn't want anyone to worship or venerate Joan of Arc after her death. This shows us how, even at that time, there was already a feeling and impression that this had been the end of the life of a saint who would later be called Saint Joan of Arc. And today, almost 600 years later, I'm here in Orleans wondering why King Charles VII did nothing to save the life of Joan of Arc. If she had done so much for him and for France, had given her own life to save France. But the reality is that she was taken prisoner by the English and condemned by the Church of England. The Protestant Reformation hadn't happened yet. It would only come in the next century. But the movement of separation between Catholics and Anglicans was already beginning. There had been the Lollard movement long before, which is considered a precursor to the Protestant Reformation. In other words, that decision made by the Church of England would probably have been different from what would have happened if Joan of Arc had been in the hands of French Catholics at that time. Even the decisions were separate, and of course there was the power of the British Kingdom determining that she should be condemned for heresy and witchcraft. And what did King Charles VII do? He acted like Pilate. He washed his hands. Was he negligent? Did he do that on purpose, consciously? Did he have any power to stop it? Or was he really powerless because in the hands of the English, Joan of Arc could no longer be saved? It's likely that this last hypothesis is true, but it does make you think, doesn't it? Why didn't Charles VII try to save the French saint? The 100 Years' War ended in 1453 with a French victory in the final battle at Castillon. It didn't last exactly 100 years, it was 116, and until the French Revolution, the English continued to claim the right to the throne of France. Divine right, they said. Only in 1797 did the British sign a treaty recognizing French sovereignty. It's incredible to think that Joan of Arc was the only person in history who was condemned to death by the Church and later canonized. She went from hell to heaven, faced the stake, the harshest sentence of that time. And then, in a review that came not long afterward, they realized that a great mistake had been made there. And we always need to remember that all this happened at a time when the Church was already almost splitting, and that the first separation would happen precisely there in England. So it's already a complicated moment. France, England, the Church on one side, the Church on the other, which soon would be separated into Anglican and Catholic. Soon the Reformation would come, but the fact is that Joan of Arc was the only person condemned to death and canonized. Now, how did that happen, right? Well, first we have to understand how she became St. Joan of Arc. And the story begins here in the center of Orleans because it was in this place that the great battle happened, the one that turned the war in favor of the French. It was also here, more precisely in the house that used to be the spot you can see behind me, which has since been renovated because it was bombed during the Second World War. But the house that used to be here was where Joan of Arc took shelter, where she stayed. When she came to serve in the French army for the first time, when she enlisted to try to save France as she had promised, what ended up happening? Joan of Arc's honor and legacy began to be restored a few years after her death. The first to do this were her mother Isabel and two brothers, Jean and Pierre. In 1452, they brought a request for a historical review of the condemnation process to the Inquisitor General of France, which was then forwarded to Pope Calixtus III. The arguments were that the trial had not been conducted fairly in accordance with ecclesiastical law. But the essential point they argued was that the process had been essentially political. And if the heroine of the French, the one who turned the war in favor of the French and led to the coronation of Charles VII, was actually a witch and a heretic, then did that coronation have no value? And the English could once again claim the French crown. 4 years later, the Church finished its investigation and concluded that in fact there were errors and abuses in the process. Yes, Joan of Arc was burned alive, considered a witch and a heretic, which was the worst possible sin at that time. But in reality, she should have been considered, as happened later, a saint. Almost 5 centuries passed between the death of Joan of Arc and her canonization. The process was opened by the Vatican and took into account the signs that the French heroine showed, such as declaring divine inspiration for her actions, as well as the fact that she identified King Charles VII, who was in disguise without ever having seen him before. Over time, believers who prayed to Joan of Arc said they were healed. Many graces are said to have been received, and the canonization process was completed in 1920, when Pope Benedict XV declared her Saint Joan of Arc, and she became part of the pantheon of patron saints of France.